Hello and welcome to another episode of the Feudal Future podcast. I'm Marshall Toplansky.
I'm Joel Kotkin.
And today we're going to continue our series on Latinos with Mike Madrid. Mike's new book, The Latino Century, How America's Largest Minority Group is Transforming Democracy, came out in June. Simon & Schuster, terrific book. And it really brings up a lot of the issues that we've been focusing on over the past year in terms of what does it take for success in the Latino community, and how are Latinos realigning themselves politically? Joel, you want to kick us off?
Yeah, I think the first thing is in discussions of Latino issues, you usually hear about immigration. Sometimes you hear about family issues. But I look at it, and the work that we've done at Chapman focuses on the economic. What really should be the economic agenda that would help Latinos move up into the middle class on a larger basis?
Well, look, I think it's important that you're focusing primarily on economics and economic issues, because that's what Latino voters have been telling us, screaming at us really in polling for 3 decades now, probably longer, but certainly for the last 30 years. The centrality of the problem as it relates to economics is housing affordability, housing costs. And it's really on both sides of the housing issue. 1 in 5 Hispanic men are employed nationally. 1 in 5 Hispanic men nationally are employed in the construction industry or related field. This is residential construction. It's an extraordinary number. It's basically 20% of the Latino household income comes from construction and industry. And because Latinos are younger, 30 is the average age, we're at that first-time home buying age. So having a housing policy, really a Marshall Plan for housing, is what's required in California if we're going to move anywhere else on the economy. And I would even argue on social issues, whether you want to talk about health disparities, poverty issues, even educational attainment, all of this is you've got to have a housing policy that gets people into ownership in this state.
You know, Mike, it's interesting to look at Latinos because historically we've thought of Latinos as a minority group, but in fact, it's increasingly, especially in California, becoming a majority group, a mainstream group. Help us understand the transition that Latinos themselves are going through and how they think of themselves differently than they might have thought of themselves, say, 30 years ago.
I think that's really the right way to phrase it, is what we're witnessing. And 30 years is the exact frame of reference. 30 years ago this year, there was this notorious ballot measure that the citizens qualified, Proposition 187, which was many people considered a draconian measure. Certainly the Latino political class viewed this as a momentous moment where multi-generations of Latinos felt under siege, under attack, and voted for the first time as a bloc, as an ethnic voting bloc in the state. And that has persisted largely in California anyway, until 30 years now, this later date. But something peculiar is happening. And that is almost 40% of Latino voters are 30 years of age or younger, which means they have no living memory of Proposition. They weren't alive during Proposition 187. So this catalyzing kind of civil rights moment isn't in their memory. But what is this sort of economic populist sentiment that the economy doesn't work, never worked for their parents, and isn't working for them. And so we're witnessing the transition of the idea of Latinos being an ethnically, racially motivated voting bloc to an economic populist pocketbook voter. And this shift really began in earnest outside of California. We can get into the whys of why that happened. And really in the largest ethnic demographic transformation in this country in maybe 100 years, California was a lagging indicator. It was behind the times. It was really the belief that demographics as destiny takes root in the Obama years, with this false assumption that non-white voters are 70% plus Democratic voters. So the Democrats just in the maternity wards would turn the country blue. That, of course, is a very elementary understanding of ethnicity and the way societies evolve and change generationally. And in fact, since 2012, we have seen a decline of Latino engagement with the Democratic Party to the point now where, as it's rapidly growing nationally, it is becoming a threat to Democrats' ability to hold on to its status as a national party, a national force, and that all expectations are that will continue.
Well, I think one of the key issues besides housing, which is clearly maybe number one, so many of my Latino friends, if I ask what their brothers do or what their fathers do, it's often construction. But the other part of it, which Jennifer Hernandez, who we've had as a guest quite often, points out, is that the environmental laws that the California Democrats have adopted have been catastrophic for aerospace, for jobs that were the way up for many Latinos. When I first came and started reporting about LA in the 70s, that was the great miracle, Latino people coming here, working in factories, in some cases starting their own companies, learning a very valuable skill. And the California environmental laws have devastated that as well. And yet I don't see anybody addressing this as Jennifer does, as a civil rights issue.
Well, I think there's two things there. I mean, addressing housing as a civil rights issue is really, I think, not only important and critical, but it's just kind of a no-brainer for Latino elected officials. Challenging environmental laws, while I agree with a lot of what you just said, this overreach of our environmental laws, CEQA specifically, becomes much more politically fraught. It's kind of like it's many ways it's like California conservatives who have tried to kind of attack teachers unions with Latino voters, saying your students are the ones suffering the most. And while that's true, it's just very tone deaf in the approach of attacking teachers unions. That was never going to work. I don't know who thought that up. It was a very bad idea. I think it just doesn't have the cultural nuance and understanding that attacking teachers and or unions is just not, it's not going to work. And I think it's the same with environmental laws. There's just such a much better way to approach it than to make environmental laws and restrictions, no matter how egregious and overreaching, the center of the debate. It's just not the right way to approach it.
And to be fair about it, while Latinos are disproportionately affected by these regulations, everybody's affected by them. This is not a good situation for anybody. So I can understand your point on that. But one of the points you make in your book, Mike, is that whether or not it's been intentional, Latinos are moving more toward the GOP. Mm-hmm. And I guess my question to you is there a strategy there on the part of the GOP to do this, or are they succeeding in spite of themselves?
Or with the help of the Democrats?
Right. Well, that's exactly right. The Republicans are winning a greater share despite their best efforts, not because of them.
Right.
In fact, they really don't have much efforts other than speaking to the working class, which they are doing, and they're doing it well. And Latinos nationally, 71% of all new entrants into the workforce between 2020 and 2030, we're about halfway through that, are going to be Hispanic. It's just the extraordinary tsunami of workers that are Latino entering the workforce. 80% of those are non-college graduates. This is the blue-collar workforce. These are the lunch bucket guys. These are construction sites, energy patch, assembly lines, swinging hammers. And they're voting increasingly like their non-Hispanic white counterparts. So, they're listening to Joe Rogan. They're not listening to ranchera music. They're consuming media and have their kids playing ball games on Saturday together. They don't view themselves much differently. In many ways, it's a very typical assimilative story that we've known throughout our country's history. In many ways, the story is remarkable because it's not that remarkable.
So this is a melting pot. This is a melting pot situation. Just like with other ethnic groups historically through the U.S., people are becoming less identified with their ethnic identity, more blending with the U.S. zeitgeist as a whole.
I would challenge that a little bit, only because normally when diasporas came in the past, they would come essentially in a 15 to 20-year interval. And they would get kind of consumed into the melting pot. They would be very small. There are some exceptions to this. The Ellis Island, waves were extraordinarily large, but a lot of that was more anti-Catholic, concern than it was necessarily a different nationality, although they were intertwined. This is different, and it's different because For the first time in the country's history, at least in the last, century and a half, America will be a non-white European country in about 15 years. And some of the differences are because we're so close to the country of origin. The border between the United States and Mexico is the largest border between essentially a first and a third world country anywhere on the planet. That's one. Two, the length of the migration has been like 3.5, 4 decades. And technology allows for us to get that continual reinforcement. We're talking to our families every day. This isn't the stereotypical, 12-year-old Italian kid who stowed away on a ship and came across the Atlantic never to return, right? This is like you go back for Christmas every year. So there's a cultural reinforcement, there's a proximity, there's a technology aspect that has slowed the assimilative process. And I argue in many ways, the melting pot analogy doesn't really work anymore because with this transformation, in many ways, sort of white Americans are becoming more Latino than Latinos are becoming more like white Americans.
Well, at least it'll improve the food. But one of the things I'd like to just focus on a little bit is governance. And I just want to share an experience I'm having on something I'm working on with another faculty member at Chapman. When you go into the parts of LA City or LA County, I drove from Koreatown all the way to Southgate. Looked like the Mexico City on a bad day. I mean, it really was horrible. Streets are falling apart. All the commerce is out on the streets with used clothes. You get into Southgate, a 90+% Latino city. It's clean. There's a factory. The moment you get into the city, there are beautiful medians. So I've been asking in other cities, where heavily Latino cities like Paramount, I'm doing this project on these South LA cities. What's really interesting is these cities, unlike LA, they're completely run by Hispanics. Almost all the mayors are Hispanic. Almost all the council people are Hispanic. But because it's a local government and many of them are second, third generation, some are moderate Democrats, some are Republicans, it seems to be a much better result. The schools are better. What struck me was no graffiti, no homeless, almost no vacancies. Mm-hmm. So I think that this model of how Latinos can turn around things is something that is just not being written about. And what the problems are, let's say, in the city of LA, where politics are sort of gangsterism without Luciano's rules.
Yeah, look, I think of all of those characteristics, and I think you're absolutely right. You are absolutely right. I mean, you're seeing it. It's your eyes are telling you the truth. I mean, it's there. But to me, the biggest transformation from maybe those communities, 15, 20 years ago, when the city of Bell and those cities were going, the corruption corridor, as we came to know it, where there was a lot of immigrant, council members who didn't really understand the civic process, didn't even know they were breaking the law or pretending they weren't. The difference is that second and third generation that you're mentioning. And let me give you a quick statistic. In 2002, in Los Angeles County, the largest Latino county in America, 54% of all Latino registrants, new Latino registrants, 54 were foreign born. So over half. By 2022, 20 years later, that number was at 8%.
That's really interesting, yes.
8%. Like, it's just completely collapsed. And it's demographically, you can show the correlation between the height of migration legally and illegally from 2007 and just draw a straight line. And the growth in Latino voting behavior in the Latino population is increasingly third now and fourth generation, but US-born Latinos dominate and are overwhelming. And so this immigrant narrative is really becoming a relic of the past. That doesn't mean that the focus of the Democratic Party specifically isn't still on those issues. There was just a bill vetoed yesterday, I think, or 2 days ago, allowing a huge down payment assistance to the undocumented to buy houses in California. It's like, what are you talking about? Like, there's millions of legal Latinos that could use that direct assistance. We can debate that, but you're setting aside monies for the undocumented for down payment assistance. It's just absurd.
But why does an idea like that get there? Because if you want to create a divisive situation. Besides the fact that the state is broke, so I don't know where the money comes from, but that was never a problem, I suppose. What leads to that? I mean, it just strikes me that when I talk to these Latino mayors in Downey and places like that, I say, hey, these are sensible people who have, who could do things that are successful that the city of Los Angeles can't do. Okay. Why not use that as your agenda instead of going back to, well, every undocumented person should be allowed in with no restraint or whatever the PC position of the moment is?
Well, there's two reasons. There's actually three. But the first is, again, California, Latinos specifically, are much more recently migrated and naturalized than anywhere else in the country. That's a big part of it. That is changing. As I just give you some good statistics to show you that is changing and changing quickly and changing dramatically. And that is going to change the politics. That focus will not be there. In fact, we're witnessing this nationally, where Kamala Harris has shifted the immigration debate to an exclusively border security debate. As in Washington, D.C. a couple of days ago, telling Georgetown, this immigration panel, when I worked for George W. Bush in 2000, if he had heard Kamala Harris's immigration proposal, he would say that was racist and un-American. She's like to the far right of where Republicans were in 2000. That's how much the Overton window has moved. But part of the politics of California has been focused on this overwhelming number of the foreign-born. As that changes, the politics are changing, and we're right on the cusp of something very significant, even here in California. The second is housing has really limited economic mobility. We are starting to see longer-term generational poverty, right. And the Democratic Party is a party of very wealthy whites and very poor Latinos in California. That's the coalition, and that tenuous coalition
and the public sector.
Yeah, but that's such a small part of the electorate. I mean, you're talking single digits.
But money.
Well, but given that, are you seeing in the overall statistics, are you seeing greater or lesser civic engagement on the part of Latinos, recognizing that they are becoming younger, you're younger and more American born?
That's a great question, because for 25 years we've been grappling with these very low voter turnout rates, and we've been dealing with this lack of civic engagement. The question now is, this next new generation, these U.S. born generations, are they more? And what I'm seeing is not yet. First of all, it's relatively new, but here's the concern. This is a very populist voter. It looks like they're shifting to the right because Republicans are picking up the votes, and so technically it's true, but they're not becoming more conservative. And I would argue they're not even becoming necessarily anti-democratic. They just find the Democratic Party so damn unrelatable that it's meaningless.
You're talking about cultural
and it sounds
issues
like
too?
It's also pandering.
Yeah,
they sound.
Pandering is politics. Pandering is politics. I mean,
but what about the cultural issues? Is that part of it too?
Yeah. But let's not overdo that. Yes, it is. There's a blue collar culture in America. There always has been. Right. When I was younger, we used to call the same voter Reagan Democrats.
Right.
We just don't like that anymore, frankly, because Republicans don't really like brown people. I'll say it. It's just the truth. That's 30 years of my experience in working in the Republican Party. They're not comfortable with it. They don't like it. When they're white, they're happy as hell about it. Call them Reagan Democrats, and we celebrated that. This is an invasion we're not really comfortable with. And then, the Mike Madrids of the party get patted on the head and say, well, you're not one of those. You're a good one, And that's 30 years of dealing with this stuff. We don't need to go down that road. But the Republican Party is very uncomfortable with this ethnic transformation. Let me give you another example. California is 34% white, but the Republican Party is 80% white. Like, if you don't see the racial correlation there, it's because you don't want to see it. It is a white identity party. And so the Republican Party, until it gets back to, and it is in some ways, being a party of the working class, which the Democratic Party has ceded that ground. And with working class comes a culture, that play by the rules culture, that goes to church or to worship services more regularly than other, higher educated folks.
Or has children.
Has children, precisely. These are all create a culture that is increasingly distinct from where the Democratic Party is moving, which is moving rapidly to being a white, wealthier, home-owning, progressive, culturally progressive party. It used to be that the Democrats would castigate the Republican Party saying, you guys are starting the culture wars. Well, look at Gavin Newsom, for example. He's consumed by running abortion ads in Tennessee and Alabama and Mississippi, right? And gun control and marriage equality and legalization of drugs. Where is the working class agenda for a state that is becoming poorer and poorer day by day by day? Like, you don't see that as part of the agenda of the Democratic Party, because it's not a working man's party anymore. It thinks it is. It still has its visions of FDR and hard hats and building dams, but we can't even build dams in California anymore. So
well, I would think that one of the key issues for Latinos would be immigration reform, things like DACA reform and making it easier for undocumented people to be gaining some form of citizenship or legalization. How does that playing out in party politics?
Well, that's not an issue. It's never been an issue. And that's been the problem, that the Democrats have believed that erroneously. And in fact, look, the Democrats have been leaning into the immigration issue and all those issues you just mentioned when it's not even registering the top 5 of voter concerns.
Among Latinos?
Yes. It has never been a top 5 issue. There's this stereotypical narrative that those are somehow the issues that people think about, even though, like I said, every poll in the last 30 years, it's never in the top 5. What is? Economic issues, affordability, jobs, right? Job creation, affordability. But here's the irony. It's not just that the Democrats get that wrong. The Republicans bought into it too. And one of the great ironies is, remember the RNC, the autopsy in 2012?
Yeah.
We need to broaden the base of the party. And the way you do that is we have to lean into immigration reform, because the Democrats are winning on this issue and they're getting all these Latino votes and we're losing them. So let's just jump onto that too. That was categorically false. But, and this is fascinating, the solution or the goal was to diversify the party. That's absolutely true. But the rationale for getting them was completely wrong. Rather than focusing on economic issues, the Republicans tried to copy the Democrats on an issue that was never a motivating issue. So what happens? The Republican Party actually becomes more diverse under Donald Trump, right, than it does under any other president in modern history.
But is part of that also the movement of Latinos? I did a report for the Heartland Forward on immigrants, and huge movement of immigrants, obviously, to states like Texas and Florida, but also even to places like Ohio, to Midwestern states, to places like Nashville. Is that changing the nature of Latino politics? Because now many Latinos find themselves in states that are not, one-party dictatorships like California.
Yeah, most of those states offer much greater economic mobility. And that's my argument. That's what I'm saying. Is the reason why California has become a one-party state is the Republicans are never going to get off of their ethnic white identity tribalism. They're not going to. They never will. If they did, they would be a very competitive party because of these economic issues. But they won't. They can't. And so, but when
they have done a better job with the Asians.
But
your point about the Republicans being 80% white, it's your point.
Precisely. Right? Yeah. And Asians have much higher college attendance and graduation rates.
Sure.
And that's part of the diploma divide. Too, is that we're seeing Asians doing a great study in Orange County right now with UC Irvine showing Asians are moving, they're becoming much more democratic now. Well, it's a big crisis in the Vietnamese community, by the way. You go to Westminster and they're pulling their hair out because their grandkids are all becoming Democrats. Yeah, they're sending them to college and they're becoming professional class, and they're motivated far more by cultural issues than they are by anti-communist sentiment from the 1970s. It's they're losing that ethnic partisan identity. It's going away.
So is your prescription for the Democrats to basically get off of this identity politics, I don't know what else you would call it, approach, and just start focusing on
bread and butter,
middle class economic opportunity?
The party that's going to be successful, the dominant party of the next generation, is going to be the party that can speak to the hearts, minds, and get the votes of a multi-ethnic working class. And the Democratic Party has a really big problem with the working class piece. And the Republicans are getting, like I said, despite their best efforts, not because of them, they have a real problem with the multi-ethnic piece. And so what explains the contradiction of how the Republican Party is becoming more multi-ethnic is the focus on economics is so strong that it's overwhelming the idea that Donald Trump is a racist. Let me give you some more an explanation. If you look at Ron DeSantis or Greg Abbott or Doug Ducey, the former Republican governor of Arizona, Brian Dawley here in California, that the sacrificial lamb, Brian's a good guy, runs against Gavin Newsom. Every one of those politicians in heavily Latino states has the distinction of at least meeting Donald Trump, but in many cases dramatically exceeding Donald Trump with Hispanic voters. So Republicans are doing better without Donald Trump.
Oh, DeSantis kicked butt.
Yeah, DeSantis is huge. Abbott overperformed. Ducey dramatically overperformed. Dawley overperformed. No one even knew who Brian Dawley was. And in fact, this data, you can run it out even further, is every Republican in every swing seat in the country did better than Donald Trump with Latino voters by a measurable number. So it's not, Donald Trump is not bringing anybody to the Republican Party. He's stalling a bigger shift that would already be there. And that's my point in California is white guys love Donald Trump. He's their white champion. He just is. I'm sorry, you could throw me out the window, not invite me back, but that's the Republicans' problem. If they picked virtually any other candidate, this race would not be close.
This has been our
we've been saying
that.
Well. If you have even Ron DeSantis would win big.
It'd be smoking him. It would be smoking her. This race wouldn't be close.
And could you imagine a debate between DeSantis or Nikki Haley, DeSantis or Haley debating Kamala Harris, who's a big zero?
Yeah, well, that's what I'm saying. Is that's the difference. But the Republicans can't quit Trump because of that nativism. That's the appeal. That is the grievance. It's the grievance politics of white identity.
But here's an irony. So in the last couple of days, the longshoreman strike was just not settled, but at least postponed for a little bit. But what it looks like is that Harris is extremely nervous about losing labor support. And so all of a sudden, the discussion within the last couple of days has been broadening the economic opportunity for middle-class people.
But as I argued in Compact, I assume you see that, about California. It's absurd for her to say, I'm a advocate of small business and economic growth for blue-collar professions and more housing, when her record in California is exactly the opposite. I mean, now the media is a bunch of imbeciles or political toadies, so I wouldn't take them too seriously. But the fact that if the Democrats ran, on the flip side of what you just said, if the Democrats ran a politician who had a clear working class, middle class message, they would destroy Donald Trump. This shouldn't even be close against a clown like this.
That's exactly right. And that's why I make the argument in my book that we're in the middle of a demographic foot race, because what we're watching is these two parties that are consumed almost entirely by cultural issues and identity issues. And the Democrats were consumed. One of the great ironies about Kamala Harris is her entire career trajectory was assisted in large part because she is a black woman from San Francisco. I mean, Joe Biden said, "I'm going to pick a black woman for vice president." I mean, that winnings the field, right? I mean, and that the Democrats, I think, have been rightfully criticized for that. But what's fascinating to me is on the immigration debate specifically, Harris has completely pivoted away and broken this racial ethnic headlock the Democrats put themselves in on equating immigration as a racial issue for Latinos. It never has been, ever. And it's certainly not now, and becoming less so. And they finally realized it when they're looking at Biden's numbers going, oh my God, like Latinos are pro-border security. 42% of Latinos support mass deportation. 69% of Latinos supported the asylum executive order that Joe Biden signed. Like overwhelming numbers, because most of the growth is third and now a discernible fourth generation. So this idea that immigration, and it's been embedded in our minds for 30 years because of the Prop 187 debate and California, turning blue as a result of it, that was the issue that we needed to focus on. And there's a generation of political consultants and politicians, Latino politicians specifically, who believed erroneously that that's the motivating issue. And what they're realizing just now in the past few months, you guys have been talking about it a while, that's not going to work anymore, and they're going to have an economic agenda that's aspirational.
It's the
focused.
economy, stupid.
It's the economy,
right.
stupid, and I believe you are going to see a younger generation, starting with those city council members that Joel was just talking about in those cities, that are tired of it. They're tired of the racist game. This guy's racist, she's racist. That doesn't clean my streets. It doesn't get graffitis off the wall. It doesn't make, policemen want to work in our communities and keep kids safe or make our schools better. Well, and that's what we're watching.
So as you look out ahead,
that was about what I
as you look out ahead, right?
Yeah.
Regardless of what happens in the 2024 election, which is, who knows, right?
Yeah,
the choice of either way. It's a squeaker.
It's a nauseating choice anyway.
Well, but it's a squeaker. The big question is the trends that Mike has identified that are gathering momentum.
Right.
How do you see the next 4 years evolving?
And maybe even going a little further, the next 10.
Yeah. Well, the biggest problem is Latinos themselves have not identified this agenda. They've been more than happy, especially in a one-party state, to kind of follow whatever Tom Steyer wants, right? Whatever the big money Democrat wants, they'll go after it and be like, oh yeah, we're environmental. Oh yeah, we're to all the white progressive that has money, that's got the political money to give. That's where they have gone. What they're realizing now is that they are the fulcrum of power, and once they begin to identify and define their own agenda as a civil rights issue, as a struggle, then both parties, I think, are going to start crashing in towards them. And that's my advice to them, is quit thinking the parties are going to figure this out. They're not. The Republican Party is never going to figure out that it needs to quit being, like a bunch of cavemen. They're not. It's 30 years, they've gotten worse. They're going to keep getting worse, and they're going to keep marginalizing themselves. The ascendant voices, though, are going to be those Latino moderates. And Latinos, by the way, Latino voters are the moderates in both parties. Think about that. And the reason why is because they're talking about blue-collar economic jobs. They're not getting into the gun control and abortion in the 9th month and the his, her, she, and whatever. Like those are not their issues. Those are unrelatable.
We won't ask for your
common
pronouns.
sense and sensibility. Right.
Yeah, and so that I believe is the future. Is politics abhors a vacuum, and there's an enormous vacuum at the moment that just opened up with this rightward shift, because at first the Democrats were denying it. They've been denying it since 2016. Now the numbers are so big they can't deny it. And Donald Trump, I believe, will increase his share of Latinos again. How much, I don't know, but another 2-3 point pop is very doable. And if that happens, regardless of whether he wins or loses, you're going to see, I think, both parties change dramatically in their focus and start getting back into trying to get to a middle-class issue. And California, I think, is a unique opportunity because the vacuum is enormous there in this state.
Well, Mike, this has been an incredibly interesting conversation.
Yes, I have to say so.
And refreshing to think that we're not
and don't forget
we're not just marginalizing ourselves. That the future of our economic discussion is common sense in the middle class.
Well,
it's a wonderful thought.
And maybe Latinos may be the secret sauce that saves American democracy in the long run.
That's the end of the book. You spoiled the end.
I'm sorry.
Well, thank you for joining us.
Buy it anyway.
Thanks for joining us, Mike. Again, the book is The Latino Century by Mike Madrid, Simon & Schuster. Terrific read. Mike, thank you again for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Thanks, guys.
The feudal future.